What's up, guys? Welcome back to the caves, and today we are revisiting our good friend and resident HR visitor, the Driller, to give you an idea on how to play him if you're just starting out in Deep Rock Galactic. If you're confused, yes, I have done a video talking about the basics of playing the Driller before, but it's a little bit outdated and it was one of my first ever videos, so I feel like I could have done it a lot more justice. So I've been going back and updating all of my initial class guides to try to be a little bit better with them. In any event, today we're going to cover how the Driller plays, the weapons and gadgets he has access to, the mission types that he is best suited for, as well as some other useful things to note about him in a little bit greater detail. But if you guys are ready, let's learn about Deep Rock Galactic's most eccentric employee, the Driller. By the way, if you enjoyed this kind of video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss another upload. So what does it mean to play the Driller? What kinds of things does the Driller do for the team, and how is he meant to be played? Well, there are two main things that people will probably tell you about the Driller. He has the most unconventional and eccentric weapons in the entire game, and that he is fun as hell to play. And to be perfectly honest, they're not wrong. His weapons are a little bit unorthodox and definitely different compared to the rest of the classes in the game, and that is honestly probably the thing that people struggle with the most when first picking up this class, especially if they've played another one before, because his weapons essentially function very differently than anybody else. That does not, however, take away from the fact that the Driller is, like I said, incredibly fun to play, and while not necessarily my favorite class, is certainly one that I never have a problem with picking up. His satchel charges are a good mix of weapon and utility tool that have many different uses, from cleaving terrain to cutting up large amounts of mineral to just taking out massive groups of enemies. And there is arguably no traversal tool in the game that is as effective or straightforward, literally, as his power drills. These things can make going through even the toughest terrain or the most intricate cave systems very easy, because all you basically have to do is walk on a straight line while holding down the fire button. It may not be as direct as the grappling hook or as fancy as the zip line, but it is very easy to just cut through a wall that you cannot get around. Now, his weapon choices are where the Driller certainly separates himself from the rest of the classes. As I said, his weapons are a little bit unorthodox, as they focus significantly more on elemental damage than straight up kinetic or precision damage like the rest of the classes do. He has a very big emphasis and focus on damage over time, or in some cases heavy burst damage, depending on how you build him. But for the most part, you are going to be taking things out not by just shooting them in the face, but by lighting them on fire, freezing them in ice, or corroding them into puddles of goo. All of these factors lead to the Driller being one of the most versatile and interesting classes in the entire game that, regardless of how you feel about him, chances are you will definitely remember your time playing as the Driller at least. So now going into the Driller's actual gear setup and what he has, as I just said, he has a very big focus on elemental and status damage. He's not going to basically be poking at things from a distance using bullets, nor is he going to be spewing rockets or projectiles at massive amounts. Instead, he's going to be taking a bit more of a personal and eccentric approach in terms of the weapons he wants to bring. Now, I have covered most of the Driller's weapons in greater detail in their own specific videos, so if you want to learn more about them in greater detail, be sure to check those out, but I'm just going to do a brief overview of each piece in this particular section. So first, talking about the first primary weapon option, we have the Crisper Flamethrower. It is pretty self-explanatory. This is a flamethrower. As the starting primary weapon for the Driller, you really can't get much simpler than this. There aren't too many crazy things to note about the Crisper. It's basically just a flamethrower. You spew beams of fire at the enemy, and not only does it deal damage to them, it also lights them on fire, which makes it so that way they take damage over time. As you would assume, the weapon does 100% heat damage, so as it hits the enemy, it raises their temperature, and once it eventually hits max, the enemy is lit on fire where they take damage over time. Now, the flamethrower also has an extra layer of damage on top of it with its sticky fuel mechanic. If you spray the flame onto any surface in the terrain, it will leave behind sticky flames, which are basically just fire that sticks around and lingers for a couple of seconds. Any enemy that touches the sticky flames will have their heat built up until they eventually get lit on fire. So essentially, it's a way for the flamethrower to have lingering effects even if you do happen to miss your target. Now, since fire damage is very universally effective against a lot of things, the flamethrower is actually really good. It can bypass armor effectively well, and especially against the robots on things like sabotage missions, it can be really useful since the moment that a bot is fully lit on fire, it actually dies immediately. So the flamethrower can actually be a pretty useful tool if you're on those particular types of missions, or if you just want to have something that can handle very heavily armored threats very easily. Now, there are some really good mod choices that the flamethrower has access to. such as triple filtered fuel or sticky flame slowdown, or one of my personal favorites, heat radiance, which just makes your flames that much more effective. Now for overclocks, the flamethrower actually has a pretty good mix of simple options like sticky additive, which just make your sticky flames a little bit better, fuel stream diffuser, which just gives the weapon a little bit more range, to more powerful or eccentric choices like face melter that just makes your fire do insane amounts of damage, or my new personal favorite choice, the scorching tide, which basically allows you to just charge up and fire a wave of fire at your enemies. Essentially, if you like lighting things on fire, the Crisper is of course the weapon that is designed for you. The second and literal polar opposite to the flamethrower is the cryo cannon. As it is to be expected, the cryo cannon is all about freezing things rather than setting them on fire. Instead of spewing flames, it spews icy slushy that instead of raising the enemy's temperature to lighting them on fire, it instead lowers them to the point where they will eventually become frozen. Now, freezing things is incredibly useful in this game, as when an enemy is frozen, they take triple damage from all sources. This makes the cryo cannon very useful at softening up large groups of enemies, or those large singular threats that you want to take out relatively quickly. And on a side note, if you freeze any flying enemies like Mactera, they will actually fall out of the air immediately and die, so essentially freezing things is perfect if you have something like Mactera Plague. Whereas the flamethrower is more about sowing chaos and making the enemies freak out, the cryo cannon is more about just stopping the enemies cold in their tracks, pun intended. For mod choices, the cryo cannon has some pretty straightforward options with things that increase the freezing power to help you cool down enemies faster, and my personal favorite is cold radiance because it just makes it significantly more effective at freezing everything around you. Now for overclocks, there are some tricky options that you might want to stay away from when first starting off, like the ice spear and the snowball. While they are effective, they are a little bit more complicated to get used to if you've never used the weapon before. So instead, I would opt for more simple choices like tuned cooler or even the brand new crystal nucleation to help you learn how to use this weapon a little bit better. While not quite as flashy or pyrotechnical as the flamethrower, the cryo cannon is still very useful and can help significantly with larger, more powerful threats. And lastly, for the primaries, we have the corrosive sludge pump, probably the most interesting of all of the driller primaries, and possibly one of the most interesting primary weapons in the entire game. The sludge pump has two firing modes. Tapping the fire button once normally will just fire a single fragment of sludge, whereas if you hold the fire button, it will release a sludge bomb that causes several fragments to fly out upon impact. Basically, do you just want to fire one little thing, or fire out a little shrapnel bomb? Now the sludge, if it hits an enemy, will of course coat them in sludge, which will make them take damage over time as well as have other effects, but if you also hit the terrain, it will instead scatter out and make a puddle of sludge, which basically acts as a hazard that the enemy has to walk through. Now the sludge can be very effective because it is naturally and innately very good against enemy armor, as it can just straight up melt through it. This can be really good against things like Praetorians or just anything that has problematic armor pieces that you need to get through. And the puddles it creates can allow you to have really good area denial and slowdown capabilities. So if you're on something like, say, a sabotage mission or a salvage where you need to hold out in one specific spot for a long period of time, this can help you greatly slow down the enemy presence and give you a little bit of breathing room. Now, it is probably the driller's most intricate primary weapon, and that's probably a very good reason why this is the last primary weapon that you unlock for the driller, as there are a couple of intricacies that you kind of need to know when using it. The ammo consumption for the charge shots, the amount of arc that you have to compensate for when firing from a distance. There are a couple of smaller things that you need to know when using this particular weapon. Now for mod choices, it's kind of all over the place, and basically the weapon wants you to kit it out for either rapid normal shots or ones that focus on massive charge shots, with things like air-sensitive compound, atomizer nozzle, or even fluoroanatomic acid that can really make the weapon shine in different ways. For overclocked, there is a very wide range of options, but really simple ones like hydrogen ion additive or volatile impact mixture can give you good benefits without much extra thinking involved. Again, while being very intricate and probably one of the hardest weapons for the driller to use, at least at first, it is still very effective when put in the right hands. Now going over to the secondary weapons, the driller has a pretty wide array of different styles when it comes to secondary choices, and the most seemingly innocuous of them is his Subata 120 pistol. At first glance, this thing seems pretty underwhelming, as it is just a normal pistol. There's not really anything super fancy about it, there's no special gimmick, there's no special factor about it, it's literally just a pistol. However, that does not make it any less effective than his other secondary weapons. First off, it is the driller's only form of kinetic bullet damage in his entire arsenal, as well well as only 2 hit scan weapons that he has access to, the other being the wave cooker, which we'll talk about a little later. Now this means that it is significantly easier to aim and hit with this thing, and since kinetic bullet damage is one of the more neutral types of damages in the entire game, this makes it so that with the Subata is really useful in pretty much any situation, and while not being incredibly flashy or extravagant like some of the other weapons, it is still very reliable and will pretty much never treat you wrong in any build that you're in. And because of its mod choices, this thing has a ton of ways that you can build it up. Things like volatile bullets or neurocorrosive toxic catalyst. You have no idea how many takes it took for me to get that right. These can all give you very strong benefits and help make the weapon function much better under certain circumstances, especially when combined with the strong elemental effects that the driller has access to with his primary weapons. And for overclocked, again, you have a very wide choice of variety, with simple things like chain hit or oversized magazine, to more eccentric options like explosive reload and tranquilizer rounds that can help give the weapon a little bit more function and crowd control, or just straight up more damage output. The second option for secondaries for the driller is the experimental plasma charger, or the EPC for short. A weapon that I admittedly do not have a crazy amount of experience or skill with, but I understand the basic premise as to how this works and understand the kind of role that it fits into the driller's arsenal, and it is one that is incredibly unique when compared to everything else. Firstly, the gun draws from a single ammo pool with an overheat function similar to things like the gunner's minigun or the engineer's shard diffractor. And like the sludge pump, you can either fire it normal by just tapping the trigger, or hold down the fire button to charge up a powerful shot which will deal more damage in a wider area of effect but cost more battery and heat. Now, because of some of the mod choices that the EPC has access to, it can actually have a wide array of uses. And to be specific, I'm going to talk about one of its tier 5 mods, the Thin Containment Field. This is a very unique mod compared to any other mod for pretty much any other weapon, as it gives the EPC a unique type of tool that it can work with. Basically, what the Thin Containment Field lets you do is use the EPC as a mining tool. Essentially, what you can do is you can charge up and fire a charged shot, and then if you fire off a normal shot at that charged shot, it will cause a large explosion that will deal heavy damage in a very wide area. Now, this on its own is pretty good and can be a useful damage dealing tool if you're good with it, which I am not, but more specifically, this can be used as a mining tool because the explosion that it creates can actually cleave and carve terrain. This means that if you have a very big gold or nitro vein, you can essentially use this and mine it all in one shot, which can be incredibly useful if you're good at it. This gives the EPC a very large amount of utility, and like I said before, can make it be very useful as a mining tool, which a lot of people tend to actually use it for. Now, for other mod choices, you have many different setups that you could use, and for the EPC specifically, I would recommend getting a lot of practice in with this weapon to see what fits you the best, as there are a lot of differences just between the mod choices alone that can make the weapon feel very different. And then for overclocks, just some really simple ones like magnetic cooling unit or heavy hitter can make the weapon function a lot better off as just a normal weapon, which is how I would recommend at least starting off using this weapon before trying to go into the more intricate details. Then lastly, for secondaries, we have the Colette Wave Cooker. Probably one of the most unique secondary weapons in the entire game, as it is basically just a repurposed and salvaged microwave emitter that is turned into a weapon, which is probably one of the most on-theme weapons for the driller to have. Again, similar to the EPC, it draws from a single ammo pool with a overheating mechanic. Now, this weapon fires a continuous beam of energy that is the second hit scan weapon that we have access to in the driller's arsenal. And what's more interesting about this particular weapon is it does 50% heat and 50% radiation damage, which can actually be very useful in a lot of circumstances. Again, heat damage is very useful against many different things, and radiation damage on top of that can be very useful. Now, the biggest thing with this particular weapon is maintaining the battery and making sure it does not overheat, especially since one of its mod choices, you have access to a different firing mode, which in some cases can make the battery consumption a lot faster. So that's one thing to keep in mind when looking into this weapon. Now, it does have a lot of mods that focus on elemental damage and building off of existing elemental effects, such as Contagion Transmitter or Exothermic Reactor, which both function very effectively when combined and coupled with other elemental or status effects as well. Now, for overclocks, there are some pretty wild options out there with things like Blistering Necrosis and Gamma Contamination, which can be very strong but can make the weapon a little bit unwieldy if you've never used it before. So sticking with simple things such as Liquid Cooling System or Mega Power Supply are pretty good ways to start off with, because it allows you to use the weapon a little bit more effectively and understand the way it works before going into some of the more crazy overclocks. Again, the Colette Wave Cooker is a very unique and interesting weapon that requires a good amount of practice before you get the hang of, but once you do, you can see that it can not only be a very good single target detrimental tool, but also a relatively good crowd control tool as well. Now we're going on to the grenades that the driller has access to, and he has some pretty interesting choices that are quite varied amongst all of them. His starter choice is the impact axe, which is my personal favorite. It is literally a throwing axe that does an insane amount of impact damage and is really good at single targets. Now it does have a little bit of an explosive radius as well when it actually impacts the target, but more or less you're going to be using this for its single target capabilities. It has a 100% chance to stun, so it is very good at keeping something locked down. And what's more interesting is it actually counts as melee damage, which means that you can actually benefit from melee-based things such as Vampire in order to get a little bit more benefit out of it. Now, a good thing that makes the impact axes very forgiving is if you do happen to miss your target and it impacts the terrain, you can actually just go and pick it up and recover it, which is very useful, especially if you're someone like me who sometimes likes to throw grenades when he doesn't necessarily have to. The next option is the HE grenade or high explosive grenade. This is basically just a standard frag grenade that if you've played any other type of first-person shooter in the world, you've probably used this in some way or another. Now, it does have some interesting aspects where it has a very high amount of armor break, so you're going to be able to break armor very easily with this, and it has a strong fear factor, so anything that doesn't die from the explosive radius will essentially run away in fear. But aside from that, it's basically just a standard grenade practice of pull the pin, wait a couple of seconds, and throw it into the crowd and let it do its job. Then we have the neurotoxin grenade, which is a little bit different, as instead of it doing any sort of explosion, it actually lets out a poisonous gas that does damage over time to enemies that are caught in the cloud. It's good for dealing sustained damage over multiple different enemies over a wide area, but sometimes the damage can be a little bit too slow for my personal likings. And if you are looking for damage over time effects, the driller probably has a lot more potent options than this. Now, one interesting aspect about the neurotoxin grenades is that the gas can actually be ignited. So if you are running the flamethrower, or if any of your teammates are running anything that has to do with fire, they can actually use this to make a big blanket explosion of fire, akin to something like the gunner's incendiary grenades, which can be pretty useful for covering a wide area. And lastly, we have these spring-loaded rippers, which are basically a group of buzzsaws that you throw out that follow the terrain and shred anything that they come across. Now, these are a little bit tricky to use, and personally, I'm not a big fan of these particular grenades because they function a little bit too niche in most situations, and I rarely ever can find a situation where I actually want to use them. Not to mention, they can literally hit anything, and the amount of friendly fire damage these things do is actually kind of insane. So more often than not, you're going to either hit yourself or your teammates with this, which isn't going to be a very fun time. Now, there are a couple of instances where you could use this, like say an escort duty mission in the tunnels that Doretta makes, or a couple other fancy setups where if you set up a bunker, or if you just have a really good cave generation that can utilize this. But for the most part, it's a little bit too specific for my likings to try to use these things. Now, next up, we're going over his support tool, which is the satchel charge. And at first glance, you might think the satchel charge is a support tool. That doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Well, it is, and when the driller is not using it to unpolitely take out some of his teammates, satchel charge can actually be pretty useful in certain situations, and either as a damage or utility tool, it has a lot of different capabilities. It functions very similarly. You basically deploy it and throw it down to the ground, where it makes a beeping noise and emits a bit of a sphere that allows you to see the explosive radius that it'll have when you do detonate it. Then all the driller has to do is hit the button and the explosion will happen, and not only will it do very high amounts of damage, but it will also carve any terrain that it is currently near. This can, similar to the EPC, make the satchel charge a decent mining tool. However, I would not recommend using it for that purpose. It can be done in a pinch if you really need it. However, there aren't too many situations where I would say that you should do that. It can be very useful to use these for combat tools when doing things like eliminations and fighting the dreadnoughts, to especially doing things like the sabotage missions, because it can make the caretaker fight very easy if you are able to get above the caretaker and drop the satchel charges down on top of it. Aside from that, using it to take out advancing hordes on escort duty missions or maybe even salvage operations. As I said, there are a very wide variety of ways that you can use a satchel charge. But as a quick PSA, don't use it to blow up your teammates. I understand it can be funny sometimes, but it really just feels bad to some people when you use it to blow them up. So don't blow up your teammates, and instead use it on the bugs. After all, that's probably what Mission Control wants you to do anyway. Then next up, talking about his traversal tools. As I said earlier in the video, the driller probably has one of the best and most straightforward traversal tools in the entire game, with his reinforced power drill arms. These things are pretty straightforward, pun intended. as they basically just allow the driller to carve through any terrain with record speed. Now granted, yes, everybody has a simple pickaxe that they can use to break through terrain, but it's not nearly as effective as these powerhouse drills. It's pretty straightforward. You press and hold the fire button to see the drills rev up, and you just walk forward. You will cleave through the terrain in a big enough area to where you and your allies can comfortably walk through. And there's basically no limit to the type of rock that you can cut through except for the naturally occurring bedrock that appears on the very edges of the caves. And while unfortunately the drills are not capable of directly mining minerals, which is still something I think should be added into the game, you are able to kind of mine minerals with the drills in a sort of a roundabout way. Basically, if you use the drills around the said resources, if you separate them from the wall, they will pop out and basically just fall. So that is a bit of a roundabout way that you can use the drills to carve minerals. But ultimately, what you are going to be using these things for is to cut paths between connecting corridors that might just be very problematic, as well as just making pathways throughout the caves that your teammates can use very effectively. One of the simplest and most common jobs that the driller has is at the end of the mission, wherever the drop pod lands in order for extraction to happen, essentially the driller will just carve a straight line from wherever they are to the drop pod to make it as simple and as straight as humanly possible, provided of course the cave is not already basically leading you back there. But from other things like laying down pipelines on on-site refining missions, to creating bunkers and getting the hacking pods and the fuel cells into good positions on things like salvage operations and sabotage missions, the drills just have such a wide amount of utility and capabilities that you can use them in that make them probably, at least in my opinion, the best traversal tool out of all of the classes in the entire game. Now to talk about some of the mission types that the driller specializes in and how he can be useful on them. Well, the driller has obviously a very big focus on traversal and getting through terrain very easily, as well as high elemental damage, which can be very useful in a lot of circumstances. Firstly, for deep scans, he can be very useful in, as the cave systems in those particular mission types can be a little bit wonky to traverse sometimes, and can be a little bit labyrinthian in some ways, so the driller can basically just cut a path directly to where he needs to go, or just follow the indicators that are leading him to the resonance crystal so he can get them very easily. Also, escort duty missions are pretty good for the driller because his drills are able to cut through many different things that the Armor and Hearthstone might try to throw at you. For starters, he can cut through the crystals very quickly, which can make that phase not too much of an issue. Secondly, if somebody does get hit by the claw traps that were newly implemented by the escort duty mission, he can just cut through them very quickly if he himself is caught or if one of his allies is caught as well. Also, sabotage missions, as I said before, are really good choices for the driller, especially if he has the flamethrower, because again, the bots are very, very weak to fire, so he can take them out pretty quickly. And also, like I said before, the strategy with the throwing the satchel charges on top of the caretaker can make it very, very easy. But probably above all of them, the mission type that he excels at the most is on-site refining for a very simple reason. He is able to cut a straight line from the refining platform to all the pump jacks and basically ignore any and all stupid terrain generation that you might be dealing with. Now, yeah, sometimes it might be a little bit too much even for the driller to handle, but for the most part, you are going to have a much simpler time laying down the pipelines in an on-site refining mission with a driller than without one. In fact, I would say it is probably the best practice if you are on an on-site refining mission to let the driller basically solely focus on being the one to put down the pipelines, and you just focus on doing whatever the secondary objective is or finding the machine events or what have you. And provided you have a driller who knows what he's doing, let him handle setting up the pipelines and the tunnels because he will have a much easier time than anybody else. Well, there you have a basic guide to learning how to play as the driller, and hopefully you learned a couple of things, and hopefully I did a little bit better job than I did before. As I said before, the driller is probably one of the most fun classes to play as in the game, albeit a little bit confusing to learn at first, but once you get the hang of him, he is probably one of the biggest benefits that your team can possibly have. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful and informative. If you did, please be sure to give it a like because it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. And consider becoming a member today as it really helps out the channel a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I will see you in the next video.